that one or more student groups performed in the bottom 5%. That designation is done annually, with the first one being done this year, 2019. Additional targeted support and improvement, ATSI, are first, you identify the TSI school, but one or more of those student groups is taken out and as like it was a school on its own, it would perform in the bottom 5%, similar to priority schools. So that means one or more student groups that would be identified as priority is considered a school on its own, would be identified as ATSI. And both TSI and ATSI schools are considered focused schools. So a summary of today's webinar, again, today we will talk about TSI and ATSI schools, requirements and supports the states will provide. So what we know about TSI and ATSI schools is that in your district and school plans, you must address the needs of the identified student group or groups. We will discuss in a few minutes options for state support. And schools must provide notification of the designation to parents. We will discuss that as well in a few minutes. Later in the webinar, we will have a grant opportunity for ATSI schools only. At that time, we will allow those schools or districts that do not have ATSI schools to get off of the webinar so that we can talk only with those schools designated as ATSI about the eligibility for a competitive grant issued by the state.
Okay, so Felicia just gave the overview. This is Megan speaking again of what we'll go through today in terms of requirements and supports for ATSI and TSI schools. Let me now dig in a little bit to expectations for schools. So planning requirements are probably the biggest piece that schools need to take on immediately if they are identified for either ATSI or TSI status. Both types of schools must explicitly address how they will support the needs of their identified student groups in their school plans that are due September 1. In terms of how to do that, we're asking that schools include at least one prioritized need in their plan for each student group and one or more clearly defined root causes of that need. So doing what you do in your broader school plan, but really focusing on the needs and causes behind those needs of your identified student group or groups. Then including one or more strategies to address those needs and at least one benchmark indicator for that strategy to determine how you will know along the way if the work you're doing is leading to improvement for that student group. As you consider the needs and strategies for support for this group, you have a couple options of how to approach this. You can either add something completely new to your plan or build off something that's already there. But either way, you should explicitly address what additional support is being provided to the identified student group. For example, if you have, you could put in your plan tomorrow after this webinar a completely new strategy around how you plan to support the needs of EL students if that's what you were identified for, or you could build off of a strategy you already have in place as you've been drafting your plan, perhaps around, say, differentiated instruction, but then you must add in language to address how you will explicitly support those EL students through that strategy in ways that are different than what you're doing for all students. So in order to ensure that your districts who are reviewing these plans and the state can identify where you have included this explicit language, we're asking that you use red font in your plan to identify the components that are intended to specifically serve the identified student groups. And to reiterate again, your school plans will continue to be due on September 1st with these additions included. sorry, we were pausing because some people are chatting that the audio is skipping. Let me, I don't know if it's fixed, but let me continue walking through the slides. Y'all should continue to chat if you are having trouble, and maybe at that point we can try to call back in. And I can clarify in questions anything that folks might have missed. So let me continue, and then we'll continue to monitor how well you all are hearing. And I do apologize about that trouble. Could you also, as a reminder, mute your phones, as I'm getting a little bit of feedback, which certainly won't help with our audio challenges. Okay, so I talked through briefly, and again, happy to answer questions when we get to that point on the planning requirements for schools. Let me talk through the parental notification piece that Felicia mentioned in her overview. So in addition to planning, schools identified for either ATSI or TSI are required by federal law to notify parents of the school status. A template is provided on the department's school improvement webpage. It is linked here, so when you get the PowerPoint, you should be able to access that. And I can also chat it as soon as I'm done speaking and hand the baton to Felicia. I will chat it into the chat box so that you can access that link. But we provided a sample template for you to use on our school improvement webpage. There are two things you must do once that notification is sent. First is ensure that you have done that by September 1st. And second is upload a copy of the communication that you sent to the upload documents section of the school plan in Inform TN. So again, parental notification required by federal law by September 1st. We have a template for your use on our website, and you should upload the communication that you send, just one sample of it, to the upload documents section of Inform TN. I see Adriana just chatted the link to that template. Thank you very much. Okay, so we've talked through really those two big requirements for ATSI and TSI schools. Let's shift gears and talk about what is required of districts who have one or more of these schools in their district. So similar to the school requirements, there are planning requirements for districts. Districts with one or more schools that are designated as TSI or ATSI are required to answer a supplemental question in Inform TN. This question will basically be a supplement to your 2020 district plan that was completed and approved this past April. The question will ask districts to articulate their role in supporting the improvement plans of their schools. This supplemental question will be loaded into Inform TN tomorrow, August 16th, and it will be found on the Reflect on Plan page in Inform TN. District plans will also be moved back into draft status until the supplement is complete and approved. As districts draft their supplemental support response, they should consider the ways in which they might need to update their own plan, much like schools are doing, to include this explicit support. So in addition to answering the question, districts should then go into the main part of their plan and use red font to identify the additional areas where they'll be supporting ATSI and TSI schools. These supplemental question responses and any necessary plan updates are due from districts October 1st. At the same time that districts are writing your supplemental supports, you will also be reviewing school plans to ensure that schools have quality strategies for improvement identified that are aligned with the district's vision and goals. These two things are kind of happening simultaneously on purpose so that districts can ensure that the supports they're articulating in their supplemental response and in their plans are aligned to the strategies that schools have articulated in their plans. And so the goal here is that there is coherence among the two. Okay, so we've talked through the requirements for districts and schools. Let's talk briefly about support from the state. Core offices will be reaching out to districts to provide support as districts and schools work to develop these additional components of their plans. Many of you have likely already heard from them and have these meetings scheduled. But the core teams are aiming to meet with a district team, which includes the principals of the school or schools that are identified for ATSI or TSI status. Simply due to timing and capacity, we're aiming to meet one-on-one with district teams who have ATSI schools, and then meet in group sessions with district teams that only have TSI schools. But this may vary by core region based on the number of schools identified and their capacity to engage in those one-on-one meetings. That is to say, we may meet one-on-one with district teams with TSI schools where we can, as that is always preferable to us to be able to support you more deeply. The meetings with the core office will focus on equipping teams with some processes, tools, and strategies that they can use to identify those needs, root causes, and plan strategies for improvement in order to make those updates to their plans. Additional supports will be available throughout the year from both the core offices and other external partners. We are still determining exactly what this support will look like because we recognize that it can't be a one-size approach statewide. We're really trying to build a customized support plan for each region based on the landscape and the needs of the schools identified in that region. So as we move forward with developing those region-specific plans, additional information will be released to let you know what is available specifically for your district and school in your region.
So at this time, we will pause for questions. So if you could use the chat box to type in any questions you have at this point before we transition to ATSI grant opportunities. So at this time, we'll pause for a few minutes. Please write any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll try to address them.
Hi, everyone. As we're reading through the questions, please make sure to mute your phones. We're getting a lot of feedback. Okay, let me take on the first question we've gotten. And again, I need everyone to mute their phones. Actually, let me just pop out of the webinar real quick and see if I can mute everyone. Give me 1 second and then I'll answer your question. Okay, I think I've muted everyone now. Let me answer the first question we got, which was if your student group, the identified student group is 90% of the school, how should that impact the way you make edits to your school plan? So it obviously doesn't make sense to change your whole plan or put everything in red. That's not really a useful exercise for anyone. So I think we would just ask that you do go back through your plan and take an eye towards ensuring you've really dug into the needs of the student body as a whole and feel confident in your strategies for improvement. And then I think what you can do is just put a statement in your plan somewhere. I'm not totally sure where because I'm making this up as we go, but put a statement in your plan that says you've reviewed the plan and because your student group is a whole school issue, you believe that the strategies you have included will lead to improved outcomes. So in summary, basically just taking a closer look at your plan with an eye for that need, and then including a general statement that speaks to the nature of your student group and that it's a whole school need, and you have reviewed your strategies to ensure they will meet those students' needs.
We have a couple of additional questions about the webinar recording and the copy of the PowerPoint. Yes, those will be available, and they will be sent out afterwards via the core directors, and then we will also put it on the school improvement webpage. There was a question about, how will we know when someone from the state will meet with the specific schools? You should have received an email from your core director, or you will very shortly. They're in the process of doing it right now. If you have not heard from them by Monday, I would reach out to your core director to schedule the meeting. And then there was a question on how do you know which category your school is in, TSI or ATSI. That information was sent out through the accountability office, and there was a formal letter that was sent to the director of schools. But if you have a question, you can, of course, reach out to the accountability team. Jacqueline's going to give the email right now.
Yeah, the email is tned.accountability@tn.gov.
And right now that looks like all of the questions we have so far. If you have another one, please feel free to chat it in the box, and then we will move on to the ATSI grant opportunity.
And for those of you all who know for sure that you do not have an ATSI school in your district, you can go ahead and sign off. And those of you who are ATSI, please stay on for the grant opportunity section.
We'll give everybody just a second to hop off, and then we'll come back. Okay, we'll jump back in here. I'm going to turn it over to Felicia, who will talk through the ATSI grant opportunity.
Okay. We'll go ahead and begin. Districts that have schools identified as ATSI can apply for the 2019-20 ATSI grant. This grant will be renewable in 2021. However, renewal will be dependent on making progress in implementation and demonstrating effectiveness in improving school and student outcomes. So, just a side note, we know that some districts received the 2018 ATSI grant last spring. Just want to make you aware that if you have schools that have been identified again in 2019, then they are also eligible to apply for the new grant, which is the 2019 ATSI school grant. Okay. The goal of the ATSI grant is to build long-term capacity to better meet the needs of identified student groups. So all activities, strategies, and interventions outlined in the grant application that you submit must meet the following. Must meet the tiers of evidence defined by ESSA, and like you said before, you'll get a copy of this webinar with a link, and you will also get a resource guide that you can use to help you select strategies for the grant, and it will have links to this particular ESSA tiers of evidence site and others that can help you find evidence that meets the 4 tiers, and we'll discuss that in detail in a few minutes. Let's go over logistics. ATSI grant funds are Title I funds, so they must be utilized in compliance with federal regulations. The application can only be used in schools identified in 2019. But remember, if you were identified in 2018 and identified again in 2019, you can apply for the grant. Schools identified in 2018 can continue to be served on their 2018 ATSI grant, even if they're not designated this year. They can't apply for the 2019 grant, but if they received it last year, they can continue to be served under the 2018 grant through June 2020. And Title I and non-Title I schools are eligible to receive the grant because they were designated as an ATSI school. Let's talk about funding. If you look at the chart in front of you, you will see the maximum amount of funds that a district can apply for. And it is based on the number of schools in that district that have been identified as ATSI. Starting with, if your district has only 1 school, then the maximum funding amount is $150,000. If your district has 2 schools, then the maximum is $250,000, 3, $375,000. In any district with 5 or more ATSI schools can apply for a maximum funding of $1,125,000 to support all of those schools. This is the grant timeline. I'll let you read it on your own, but I want to highlight a few things. Tomorrow, you will receive the grant application along with the resource guides that I just mentioned to help you to determine the tiers of evidence for your interventions and activities. Like Megan stated earlier, the school improvement plans are due on September 1st, and they must identify student group supports, and remember to highlight those things in red. You will have until September 12th to submit the grant application to me at felicia.everson-tuggle@tn.gov. In the email you will receive tomorrow, you will get all of this information in detail. So you'll have the grant application, you'll have all the due dates and timelines, and the resource guides that accompany that, and a data sheet that we'll talk about in a few minutes. We will review the grant applications and send notifications of those districts receiving the grant award by September 25th. Megan reminded you earlier that district improvement plan revisions are due on October 1st. And for those of you all who received the grant notification, you will receive information when you receive your award about how to input your budgets into E-Plan and the due date of October 9th. That's all coming tomorrow in an email to districts with ATSI schools.
Felicia, I was going to clarify while we're on this slide, on the September 12th submission date, just to clarify for those who may not know, districts are the ones who have to submit those grant applications on behalf of their schools, so schools should expect to hear from their districts and collaborate on this request, but the submission actually has to come from the district.
So thank you, Megan, for clarifying. The districts are submitting the application on behalf of the schools, but we'll talk about what that looks like in detail in a few minutes. Monitoring. Now, in order to receive grant funds, districts will be required to submit quarterly data and progress monitoring documents. You will also receive that notification soon as well. The quarterly documents will include requested data and responses to implementation questions. So we want to make sure that the grant funds are being awarded and that you are monitoring the progress of those implementation activities and strategies that you put in the application. For those of you who are applying for the 2019-20 ATSI grant, we will be asking for a monitoring document to be turned in to us starting on January the 15th of 2020. For those districts and schools who have received the ATSI 2018 grant, you will need to send in a monitoring form each quarter, and that information will go out to districts. But for the sake of this grant, 2019 ATSI grant, we will begin monitoring on January the 15th. So back to the application process, as Megan mentioned earlier, the district will submit the application on behalf of the schools that are being served. We are asking that all principals, the districts consult with all principals of the identified ATSI schools through the application process to determine how the grant funds can support the schools, prioritize needs, and identify which schools will be served through the grant. So we want the principals to be a part of this process because we need to identify what the needs are. We need to make sure that they are prioritized and outlined in the application that is submitted by the district.
I also wanted to clarify something I meant to mention earlier when I was talking through districts approving school plans. Prior to the state issuing these grant awards to districts on September 25th, we're asking that districts who have applied approve all of the relevant school plans at that point. So even though, for the most part, school plan approval is due on October 1st, we want to make sure that before we award a grant to a district that you have approved the ATSI schools plan, and that that sort of signals to us alignment between your strategies, their strategies, and the grant application. So we will be asking you to prioritize those and review the ATSI school plans that you're applying for funding for prior to submitting your application.
So when districts receive the grant application, there will be 5 sections that they need to provide information for. You can see there that they have to identify the school served, strategy selection, evidence, implementation plan, and the E-plan budget. In addition to receiving the grant application and the resource guide to help you with strategies, districts will receive a data table that will outline all of the identified ATSI school data, and we'll see that on the next slide, to use with the application. So this is what the ATSI data slide looks like. This is a sample. Of course, when you receive the grant when districts receive the grant application, it will be filled in with all the information before you for each school identified as ATSI. We hope that you can use this to think through how you can serve each school through the grant and what strategies are applicable for the whole school or should be selected for a specific target group. A question came up earlier about what if the percent of students identified is 75 or more % of your school population. Well, then you can put in the application whether that will be a whole school strategy or if it's a smaller percentage, but it will be just for the selected or targeted specific student group.
Quick note on the data table. This is Adriana. The information in the data will only be if the student group is the identified student group for the designation. So when you get the table, it will list, for example, on this one it shows BHN and economically disadvantaged. You might say, well, I have English learners, why are they not on the table? They will not be included on the table if they are not the identified student group for the designation.
So as I mentioned earlier, all strategies, activities, and implementation steps must be in accordance with the ATSI tiers of evidence that are listed before you. There are 4 tiers of evidence. You will receive a link to websites that can help you identify whether or not your strategies are related to one of the 4 tiers. As you can see here, there's an outline of what Tier 1, strong evidence, Tier 2, moderate evidence, and Tier 3, promising evidence. And on the next slide, we'll talk about Tier 4. So if you are choosing, if your strategy is Tier 4, it can only be allowable for strategies involving mental health, RTI, and chronic absenteeism. But once again, there will be, in the resource guide, a way for you to think through what strategies and implementations and activities you're going to select for your application. And there will be specific links that you can look to gather evidence to support the tiers.
This is Adriana jumping in. So as outlined in the Every Student Succeeds Act, if you are using school improvement funds, Title I 1003A, it is required that they meet the categories of Tiers 1, 2, or 3. If you are using additional other types of funds like Title I through 4, you can use the Tier 4 category, but because this is a school improvement grant, it must fall within Tier 1, 2, or 3. What I want to highlight for you here is that it's the type of study that ESSA is getting at. So what they are trying to do is help districts think about, is it the strategy that has resulted in this increase in student outcomes? And USED has compiled information on the IES What Works Clearinghouse and evidence for ESSA, so they've done the hard work of kind of digging deep into the type of study. What we have found over the past year and a half in school improvement is that rigorous Tier 1, 2, or 3 studies just are not available in mental health, RTI, or chronic absenteeism. We have partnered with TERA, the Tennessee Education Research Alliance, and they have collaborated with us, and mental health, RTI, and chronic absenteeism research just has not caught up yet. It's being studied right now. So that's a caveat that we as the state of Tennessee are making here, in that we want folks to be looking at rigorous, thoughtful, different types of studies. The most important thing is does the strategy you are selecting, has it been studied, and has it been shown to have a positive impact on student outcomes? If a vendor has done their own study, please confirm that it is a third party that has done the study. Do not just take a vendor's word. They should have information on the fact that a third party has conducted the study. But we are allowing that Tier 4 evidence for those categories because the research just has not caught up yet.
That's a great segue into this slide. As I mentioned before, recommended websites to utilize for locating evidence are listed here. They will have a direct link from the resource guide that you will receive, and there will be a direct link from the application to be able to go to these locations. Also, as Adriana mentioned before, you can partner with an external organization to support the implementation of your evidence-based intervention. We just ask that a third party has conducted that research, as you mentioned earlier. Grant rubric. Inside your application, on the last page, or the last few pages, is a rubric that we strongly suggest that you look at while thinking about your strategies and interventions. That rubric will have what is required and what amount of points you will receive for each part of the application. Remember I mentioned earlier there were 5 sections. That rubric will identify how many points are possible for each of those 5 sections. And we just want you to make sure that you just go back and check your application to make sure you've touched on all of those points so you can get the most points awarded for that section. There are 2 opportunities to receive extra points. If you see bullet number 2, economically distressed counties will receive an additional 5 points. To see if what Tennessee is economically distressed county, you can click on the link here. Once again, you'll receive this website, this webinar with the PowerPoint, and you'll be able to click directly here, and you will also receive that in your application, a link and the resource guide. The second way you can get an additional 5 points will be if the district selects to work with an external evidence-based partner. Okay, so for additional questions that you'd like us to answer for core, Megan McLeroy's number and email address is listed here for you. For questions related to the school improvement requirements and the ATSI grant, you can contact me, and my information is provided here as well.
And we'll be happy to hang on the line and take any questions that come through the chat, so feel free to send those through now. We have one question on if a school was ATSI last year and not named this year, how do we know their status? So if a school was designated as ATSI last year on the 2018 designation and are not listed on the 2019 designation, they no longer have the ATSI status. If that school applied for and was awarded grant funds in 2018, they can continue to use those, but are not eligible to apply for the new grant. So for the question about evidence-based partner, that is if the vendor or partner that you are selecting with meets the Tier 1, 2, or 3 category, unless it's RTI, chronic absenteeism, or mental health, and then we would accept Tier 4. So that's saying that you're choosing to work with a partner that has a proven record of increasing student outcomes. If you want to do something that's in-home or grown at the district level, that's something we could talk about, but we are really honing in on that evidence-based requirement, and that's where those additional 5 points come from. Okay, everyone, we are not seeing any more questions coming through via chat, so we will conclude the webinar. Please feel free to reach out to myself, Felicia. Our contact information is up here. The accountability email is helpful if you have questions about your designation status, and then your core offices are also able to support and answer questions. Thank you all so much for joining. I hope you all have a wonderful day.